He returned to the house on the hill, the place his grandmother once used to quietly keep an entire town warm. But now, only silence remained. Just when he thought everything was over, an old dog stepped forward, carrying a photo that brought the past back to life. That house wasn't just property. It was a life built on kindness and things left unfinished. A Navy SEAL who had faced war and death now had to face a harder question: stay or walk away. And that old dog, in the quietest way possible, pulled him back into people, memories, and responsibilities he could no longer ignore, until one moment changed everything. And he realized some things aren't meant to be left behind, but to be protected. Before we begin, tell us where you're watching from. Like and subscribe, and help us reach 1,000 followers so we can keep sharing meaningful stories. Now, let's begin the journey. By the time Callan Mercer turned off the county road and took the narrow lane that climbed toward Mercer House, the late afternoon light had already thinned into a pale northern silver. Snow still lingered in the shadows beneath the pines, not deep anymore, just enough to remind the earth that winter had not fully let go. Beyond the trees, the lake lay half-thawed and quiet, its broken sheets of ice drifting near the shore like pieces of a promise that had cracked but not disappeared. He had not been home in years. The thought stayed inside the truck with him, heavy as a second body. It did not accuse him. That was almost worse. Accusation could be answered. Silence could not. Callan was 35, 6 feet tall, built lean and hard in the way military life carved a man when it had no interest in vanity. Once nothing about him was decorative. His body looked made for carrying weight, for moving through cold, for staying alert after exhaustion should have claimed him. He wore no beard. His face was clean-shaven. The sharp square of his jaw and the clear planes of his cheekbones left exposed, as if discipline still refused to leave even after the uniform had loosened its grip. His dark brown hair was cut short in a military style, though slightly longer than regulation now, enough to suggest that the rules no longer owned him completely. His skin was fair at its origin, but weathered by wind and hard climates into a northern roughness. His eyes were gray-blue steady, observant, and not unkind, but carrying the exhausted wisdom of a man who had seen too much to mistake noise for truth. His clothes looked like the rest of him, surviving, not posing. The old tactical combat shirt in faded olive gray hung close to his frame, the fabric softened by years of washing and wear, lightly frayed at the cuffs and shoulders. Beneath it, a dark red thermal layer held a muted ember of warmth. His combat pants, worn earth-brown and moss-green, were rubbed pale at the knees, the cargo pockets slouched from long use. The work boots on his feet were old military leather, scarred and reliable. An old military watch stayed strapped to his wrist, as though time itself still needed orders. Then the house came into view. Mercer House stood on the rise above the lake with the kind of confidence money could build, but only character could soften. Stone at the base, dark timber above, long windows catching what was left of the light, a broad porch, a glass house at one side, a roofline built for storms. It was large, unmistakably expensive, and yet there was nothing vulgar about it. It did not look like a place designed to impress strangers. It looked like a place built to endure winter, grief, and generations. And that permanence wounded him more than ruin would have. If the house had been broken, he could have matched it. But it was still standing, still dignified, still somehow holding shape after Evelyn Mercer was gone. That felt unfair. He parked near the side drive and cut the engine. At once, Silence closed over him. Not true silence. There was wind in the pine needles, a distant creak from a bare branch, the faint shifting sound of thawing ice. But it was the kind of quiet that made a man hear his own unfinished thoughts. He stepped out into the cold. The air slid under his shirt collar and across the back of his neck. He stood there for a moment, staring at the porch, and memory rose without permission. Evelyn standing with a cardigan over one shoulder, calling him inside before supper went cold. Evelyn laughing at something he had muttered at 16. Evelyn at the workshop door with sawdust on her sleeve, richer than most people in town, and still happier mending an old toy than ordering a new one. He had missed the end. That truth arrived harder here than it had at any airport, any hotel room, any sleepless dawn in another country. He had been too late to the funeral, too late to her last days, too late even for apology to mean anything except self-comfort. In the military, lateness could be measured in minutes, coordinates, bodies. In family, it was measured in absence, and absence had a longer echo. The front door opened before he reached it. Martha Vale stood in the entry, one hand on the brass handle, the other holding a folded dish towel she seemed not to realize she still carried. She was a woman in her early 60s, slender and straight-backed, with a long, thoughtful face, marked more by responsibility than age. Her brown and silver hair was pulled into a low tie at the nape of her neck. But her skin had the faint dryness of a person used to northern winters and practical work, and her eyes, clear, steady, blue-gray, held both sympathy and restraint. Martha had managed the Mercer household for years, but manager never captured her properly. She was part steward, part witness, part last guard at the gate of a life too large to be packed away quickly. "Callan," she said softly. "Martha." No embrace, no dramatics. That was something he appreciated. Grief did not become more dignified when strangers forced it into performance. She stepped aside and let him in. The house smelled the same: cedar polish, stone cooled by winter, old paper, a faint trace of lavender. Somewhere beneath all that, the ghost of bread and cinnamon, as if the walls themselves remembered her better than people did. The entrance hall opened wide and graceful, the staircase curving upward, the dark wood floors gleaming softly in the gray light. Everything remained in place. Nothing had been stripped, when nothing had been modernized. Even death, in this house, seemed to have been treated with manners. He followed Martha through the rooms as she spoke in a low, practical voice. The attorney would come tomorrow. There were ledgers to review, maintenance contracts to consider, trust papers, land easements, winter fund accounts, and the workshop books. Evelyn had left more than a beautiful house. She had left a structure of obligations, and everywhere Callan looked, he saw what money had meant in her hands. Not excess, not display. A framed letter from a local school thanking her for sponsoring trade apprenticeships. A stack of invoices for roof repairs paid on behalf of families who had never been named publicly. A ledger marked winter fuel assistance, a basket of handwritten notes from townspeople. Her wealth had never sat still. It had moved outward, quietly, like heat from a stove in a cold cabin. What he had spent half his life believing strength looked like armor, readiness, and the willingness to move toward danger. Here, surrounded by the evidence of Evelyn's life, another kind of strength stared back at him, one that had worn cashmere, written checks, repaired toys, funded bridge railings, and made sure no one in town had to choose between medicine and firewood in January. It unsettled him. He paused in the study, looking at an open ledger in her careful hand. She had written names beside amounts, and next to some of them, small private notes. Ashamed to ask directly, prideful but good man, daughter too young to understand, send anonymously. She had seen people clearly. He was not sure he ever had. By the time Martha left him alone near the kitchen, twilight had begun gathering at the windows. The rooms had grown too full, not of noise but of presence. The presence of someone whose taste, judgment, and mercy still shaped every object. And it became easier to breathe outside, so he walked to the back porch and sat on the top step. The workshop stood beyond the yard, dark now except for the reflection of snow and sky in its windows. Behind it, the lake lay iron-gray and still. Callan leaned forward, forearms on his knees, hands hanging loose. He did not cry. He had thought, when he was younger, that not crying meant control. Later he learned it often meant depletion. Some griefs were too deep for tears at first. They just hollowed a man out and made him quiet. He tried to remember the last phone call he'd had with Evelyn. Her voice came back in fragments. A laugh. A question about whether he was eating properly. His promise that he would visit when things slowed down. Things never slowed down. That was the lie men like him told the people who loved them because it sounded nobler than the truth, that sometimes returning hurt more than staying away. Then he heard it. At a slow scrape of claws on old wood, he turned. From the side of the porch, an old German shepherd emerged out of the cold blue dusk. The dog moved with the careful dignity of age, large still but thinned down from what had once been a stronger frame. Its coat was a layered mix of cream, gray, and black, darker over the back and shoulders, lighter at the throat and chest. The muzzle had silvered with age. One hind leg carried a faint stiffness. Yet there was nothing broken about the animal's bearing. Its ears were upright, its posture composed, its eyes deep amber darkened by shadow steady and unnervingly intelligent. A black harness wrapped its chest, edged with a deep, muted red, and in its mouth, held with delicate care, was a wooden picture frame. Callan stood without realizing he had done so. The dog approached him in silence, each step measured, then laid the frame at his boots and sat back on its haunches. For one suspended moment, the porch, the house, the lake, and even the cold itself seemed to pause around that gesture. This was the re-hook, not loud, not supernatural, but intimate enough to disturb the heart. A dog carrying memory like an offering. A house choosing this exact moment to speak through the only witness still faithful enough to remain. Callan bent down and picked up the frame. Dust clung to the glass. One corner was chipped. Behind it was an old photograph, Evelyn smiling in a pale sweater, one hand on a much younger Callan's shoulder, the other resting on the head of a younger German shepherd beside them in front of the workshop. Recognition hit him so suddenly it almost felt like pain. "Briggs," he said. The dog's ears twitched. Martha had come quietly to the porch doorway. "Yes," she said. "He's been here every day." Callan looked from the photograph to the dog and back again. Nearly 10 years ago, before a long deployment, and he had sent the shepherd home to Evelyn. He had told himself it would only be until things settled. But Briggs had stayed. Evelyn had kept him. Somewhere along the years, the arrangement had become a bond far more permanent than the promise that created it. "He remembers," Callan said, though he was not sure whether he meant the dog or himself. Martha folded her hands in front of her. "He still checks her room in the mornings, still sleeps near the workshop. Sometimes he carries that frame around the house." Her voice softened, but never weakened. "He brought it to you." Callan stared at Briggs. The old dog stared back, calm and unsentimental, as if he had simply completed a task that had been waiting too long already. The wind shifted across the yard. Somewhere out by the trees, ice cracked on the lake with a brittle, echoing sound. Callan lowered himself slowly back onto the porch step, the photograph still in his hands. Briggs stepped closer and leaned his weight lightly against Callan's leg. Warm, solid, unquestioning. It was such a small contact, it nearly undid him. He looked out at the darkening workshop, then at the house behind him, full of ledgers, letters, duty, and the touch of a woman who had known how to make wealth feel like shelter instead of distance. For the first time since turning onto the lane, he understood that he had not come back to an empty inheritance. He had come back to something still alive enough to recognize him. And that, more than the cold, more than the grief, more than the house itself, was what made him afraid to move. Morning came thin and colorless over Mercer House, as if the sky itself had not yet decided whether to commit today. Frost traced the lower edges of the windows, delicate as old handwriting. Somewhere in the walls, the heating pipes clicked awake. The house did not feel dead. That was the unsettling part. It felt paused, like someone had stepped out of a room and might return if he waited long enough. Callan had slept badly in one of the guest rooms on the east side, though slept gave too much dignity to what had happened. He had drifted in and out of shallow, jagged stretches of rest, never deep enough to stop hearing the wind outside or the old timbers settling with the cold. More than once, he had opened his eyes, convinced he had heard footsteps in the hall. The quiet, a purposeful steps Evelyn used to make when she rose early and moved through the house before anyone else. Each time the hallway had been empty. He dressed before dawn in the same worn clothes he had arrived in, his old olive-gray tactical shirt hanging close over the dark red thermal beneath. Routine still ruled him when nothing else could. Lace boots, check watch, wash face in cold water, stand still until breathing evened out. He had once believed habits like that kept a man ready. Lately, they mostly kept him from falling apart in front of strangers. When he came downstairs, the kitchen already held the soft heat of work. Martha Vale stood at the long butcher block island, sleeves rolled to the forearm, pouring coffee into a stoneware mug. In daylight, her features looked a little sharper than they had the night before. She was not a large woman, but she carried herself with the contained competence of someone who had spent half a lifetime holding together structures other people mistook for effortless. Her face was narrow, her mouth firm, her blue-gray eyes clearer than most people's after grief. She had always seemed to Callan like one of those rare souls who made no speeches about loyalty, because loyalty, to them, was simply a daily habit. "You're up early," she said. He leaned one hand on the back of a chair. "Didn't sleep much." "I didn't expect you would." There was no pity in the remark, only fact. On the far side of the room, Briggs lay on a thick, folded blanket near the radiators, not asleep exactly, but resting with the dignified vigilance of an old dog who no longer wasted energy on unnecessary movement. In daylight, his age was more visible. The cream-gray-black coat had thinned around the ribs. The fur at his muzzle had gone silver-white. One back leg remained tucked, slightly awkward, as if the joint had negotiated a private truce with pain rather than defeated it. Yet his ears still lifted at every meaningful sound, and his amber-dark eyes tracked Callan the moment he entered. The dog did not rise. He only watched. That somehow felt more intimate than greeting. Martha slid a mug toward Callan. "Attorney will be here at 9. Callan gave a humorless half-smile. "You say that like it's weather." "In this house, paperwork usually was." He took the coffee and stood by the window, looking out toward the slope behind the house. The workshop sat quiet in the pale morning, roof edged with old snow, the yard between still carrying frozen footprints from some earlier week. He wondered if Briggs had been the one making those paths back and forth in the dark after Evelyn died. The thought lodged in him more sharply than he liked. At 9:15, Graham Pierce arrived. He came up the front walk in a charcoal overcoat, with a black leather briefcase tucked under one arm, every line of him neat without warmth. Graham was in his mid-50s, tall enough to appear lean rather than frail, with close-combed salt-and-pepper hair and a narrow face sharpened by profession into careful neutrality. Rimless glasses sat low on the bridge of his nose. He had the kind of mouth that looked made for precise sentences and professionally disappointing news. Not cruel, Callan thought. Worse sometimes. Efficient. A man who had spent so long converting human mess into signatures and percentages that he had begun to trust order more than grief. "Mr. Mercer," Graham said, shaking his hand. "I'm sorry for your loss." The phrase landed with all the softness of a stamped envelope. They moved to Evelyn's study, where the cold morning light fell over ledgers, framed letters, and shelves of old bindings. Graham opened his case and began laying out papers with practiced care. He spoke for nearly an hour. The estate was substantial. The house itself, the land around the hill, the smaller parcel near the lakeside access road, the greenhouse, the workshop, several investment accounts, a family trust, and a winter emergency fund Evelyn had kept active for local use, maintenance obligations tied to a few community-facing structures along Mercer-owned ground, insurance matters, utility matters, deferred repairs, tax implications. The language was clean and dry, but the meaning underneath it was not. Evelyn had not just left behind wealth. She had left behind motion money traveling outward into roofs, heating bills, tuition, repairs, hired labor, and quiet rescue. Her estate was not a treasure chest waiting to be divided. It was a system. A living one, or something close enough to it that stopping it all at once would feel like cutting power in the middle of winter. Graham turned a page. From a practical standpoint, the most sensible course would be consolidation. Callan sat still in the leather chair, coffee cooling in his untouched hand. Consolidation. Sell the outlying parcel. Suspend the workshop operations. Terminate the seasonal assistance program in an orderly way. Reduce liability exposure around the lake structures. Preserve the main residence if you wish, or place it on the market later under better conditions. Graham folded his hands. Your grandmother was generous, but generosity on this scale creates administrative drag. Administrative drag. Callan looked toward the window for a moment, jaw tightening. His grandmother's whole life reduced to the friction it caused a clean spreadsheet. Martha, standing near the shelves, did not interrupt. But he saw the change in her face, the slight stillness around the mouth that meant she was holding herself very carefully. Graham continued. There is also the matter of the dog. Something in the room sharpened. Callan set the mug down. What matter? The shepherd is not presently under an updated ownership transfer. Mrs. Mercer remained the legal caretaker. Martha has been managing interim care, but given the animal's age and medical needs, I took the liberty of contacting Senior Animal Services at the county level after discussing the issue with Dr. Whitmore. He paused, perhaps sensing the temperature drop. They have a placement vehicle scheduled later this week, unless you intend to assume legal responsibility. Callan stared at him. For a second, he thought he must have misheard. Not the words, the implication behind them, that while he had been gone and Evelyn had died and the house had held its breath around all of it, a clock had quietly started ticking under the old dog in the kitchen. Martha spoke at last, her voice low. I didn't want him neglected, Callan. I can feed him, walk him in the yard, keep him warm, but I can't promise long-term care on my own, not if you decide to leave. Leah said he needs consistency now. The truth of that prevented anger from taking its easiest form. He leaned back slowly. When were you going to tell me? This morning, Martha said, before the paperwork swallowed the rest. Graham slid a form across the desk. If you want more time, arrangements can sometimes be delayed by a few days, but not indefinitely. Callan looked down at the paper and thought, absurdly, of all the documents he had signed in his life with less consequence attached to them. Gear check receipts, deployment clearances, incident acknowledgments, after-action summaries. Men had bled under paperwork like that. Yet this thin sheet unsettled him more because it asked a question those others never had. Stay or go? Not in words, in responsibility. He did not sign. After Graham left, the house felt colder, though the heat had not changed. Martha busied herself in the kitchen with that particular brand of useful motion people adopt when they know someone else is unraveling and wish to spare him the humiliation of being watched. Callan wandered room to room with no real purpose, hands in his pockets, boots silent on old rugs. In the music room he found Evelyn's piano closed, a small vase of dried winter berries still on top. In the formal dining room there were stacked place settings from some dinner that would never happen. In a smaller side hall, coats still hung where they had been left by people who had belonged enough to use the family entrance instead of the front. The house was rich in every material sense: good timber, imported fixtures, thick carpets, silver in drawers, paintings with signatures in the corners. But none of that was what pressed on him. What pressed on him was how deliberately Evelyn had turned wealth into usefulness. He kept seeing evidence of it. Handwritten notes paper-clipped to invoices, names in ledgers, lists titled fuel deliveries, school repairs, winter boots for Harper Boy. She had built systems of care with the same seriousness other people use to expand portfolios. And he, who had once mistaken all comfort for softness, now walked through the architecture of her strength like a chastened intruder. By late afternoon, the sky had gone pale blue and hollow. He found himself in the back corridor that led toward the mudroom and service entrance. Briggs was there ahead of him, standing with careful stiffness, nose lifted toward the air. Then the dog did something strange. Without looking back to make sure Callan followed, Briggs turned and moved not toward the kitchen, not toward the stairs, but down the corridor to the closed door of Evelyn's room. He stopped there and sat. Not scratching, not whining, just sitting, spine upright, gaze fixed on the brass knob. Callan slowed. The house was silent around them. Briggs remained motionless for several long seconds, then lowered his head once, almost like a bow, before rising again and walking away without drama. That was the rehook. Small enough that reason could dismiss it, intimate enough that the heart could not. Not a miracle. Not a ghost. Just an old dog keeping some private ritual in a house full of absences, as if faith itself could take the shape of repetition. Callan stood before the closed door after the dog left. He did not open it. Not yet. Something about that quiet pause outside her room unsettled him more deeply than the photograph had. The frame on the porch had felt like recognition. This felt like witness, a creature continuing a pattern long after the person at its center had gone. It carried the ache of devotion, stripped of reward. Toward evening, Martha convinced him to eat a bowl of stew he barely tasted. Dusk settled early. Lamps came on one by one in pools of amber. Graham's forms remained untouched on the study desk. Later, when the house had gone mostly still, Callan took a chair near the fireplace in the small family sitting room. Briggs lay stretched on the hearth rug, one flank rising and falling with slow, heavy breaths. Firelight touched the silver at the dog's muzzle. Callan leaned forward, elbows on his knees, hands clasped loosely. "You think I can do this?" he asked. He had not planned to speak aloud. The words simply came, rough and low. "You think I'm supposed to stay in a house full of someone better than me and pretend I know what to do with any of it?" Briggs lifted his head. No theatrics, no barking. Only that gaze, old, steady, grave in the way only animals and very tired people can be. Callan looked into the flames instead. "I know how to clear a room. I know how to hold a line. I know how to keep moving when someone tells me where." His throat tightened unexpectedly. "This isn't that." The dog pushed himself up with visible effort, and crossed the short distance between them and rested his chin on Callan's knee. Warmth seeped through old fabric. Callan went very still. He did not pet the dog at first. His hand hovered above the shepherd's head, as if contact might demand an answer he did not have. Then, slowly, he let his palm settle into the coarse fur between the ears. Outside, the wind moved across the lake. Inside, the house held its silence around them. He stayed there a long time, hand resting on Briggs's head, while the fire sank lower and the forms on the study desk waited for morning. He still had not decided anything. But for the first time since returning, his leaving no longer felt like the only clean option. The next morning did not arrive gently. It came sharp and bright, the kind of northern light that made every edge of the world clearer than a man might want. The sky had opened into a pale blue, thin but determined, and the cold seemed cleaner for it, less heavy, more honest. Callan stood at the back door of Mercer House with one hand braced against the frame, looking out toward the workshop. He had not planned to go there. That was the truth he held on to, as if it might excuse what his body was already deciding. His mind had spent the better part of the night circling the same exits: sign the papers, settle the accounts, let the house be handled by professionals, leave before the place began asking more of him than he could give. But morning had a way of stripping plans down to what they really were. Intentions built in darkness, went weaker in daylight. Behind him, the house was awake. Martha moved through the kitchen with quiet efficiency, the rhythm of someone who had already accepted the day's demands before the sun rose. The scent of coffee drifted faintly through the hall. In front of him, the workshop waited. Briggs stood a few feet ahead, already outside, his breath visible in short clouds against the cold. He did not look back. He simply faced the workshop, as if orientation alone could communicate purpose. Callan exhaled once, slow. "Yeah," he muttered. "You're not letting this go, are you?" Briggs flicked one ear but did not move. The distance between the house and the workshop was not far. 30 yards, maybe. The ground dipped slightly, then leveled out near the double doors. But that morning it felt longer. Well, not physically. His legs had carried him through worse, but in the way a man feels distance, when each step crosses into something he has been avoiding. The snow along the path had melted into patches of dark, damp earth. His boots sank slightly, leaving impressions that filled slowly with water. Somewhere above, a crow called once, sharp and indifferent. By the time he reached the workshop door, his chest felt tight in a way that had nothing to do with cold air. He rested his hand on the handle. For a moment, he did nothing. He had cleared buildings under fire with less hesitation. Then he pulled. The door opened with a long, dry creak, the hinges protesting just enough to sound like something waking. Inside, the air held a different scent than the housewood dust, old oil, faint metal, and something warmer beneath it, like memory stored in grain. The space was larger than he remembered. Taller ceilings, broad work tables, racks of neatly sorted timber, tools mounted in careful rows, cabinets labeled in Evelyn's precise handwriting. Nothing chaotic, nothing abandoned, just paused. Callan stepped inside slowly. His boots echoed against the wood floor. The sound felt too loud at first, like he was disturbing something that had earned its quiet. He moved further in, eyes adjusting to the dim light filtering through high windows. The workshop had not been left in disarray. On the contrary, it looked as though Evelyn had stepped away mid-task, intending to return before the day was over. A clamp still held a piece of wood in place on the central table. A small hand plane lay beside it. A box of nails sat open, but not scattered. On one side, a shelf held finished items waiting to be picked up, carefully wrapped, labeled with names. He walked closer. A child's wooden truck, repaired and polished. A music box with its hinge replaced. A carved chair arm, sanded smooth. Each object carried the quiet dignity of something once broken and then made whole again. Callan ran his fingers lightly across the surface of the table. The wood was worn where hands had worked it for years. His grandmother had been rich, but she had still chosen to stand here. That fact settled somewhere deep in him, heavy and undeniable. Behind him, Briggs entered without ceremony, his nails tapping softly across the floor. The old dog moved with care, each step deliberate, but his presence filled the space with a strange steadiness. He walked directly to one corner of the workshop and stopped. Callan followed his gaze. There, mounted on the wall above a smaller side bench, hung a narrow board with hooks and tags. Each tag held a name. Some were crossed out. Some remained. Beneath it, a worn ledger lay open. Callan stepped closer. The handwriting was Evelyn's clean, slanted slightly to the right. Unmistakable. Name, item, issue, notes. Next to some entries, she had added small comments. Don't charge. The widow. Boy worked hard to fix it himself. Show him how. Return before Sunday important. The ledger was not a business record. It was a conversation. He turned a page. More names, more objects, more quiet acts of attention. And suddenly, the room shifted, not physically, but in the way a place reveals its purpose when someone finally understands what it was built for. This was not a workshop. This was how she stayed connected to people who might otherwise have slipped through the cracks of her wealth. Callan leaned his hands on the edge of the table and bowed his head slightly. For a brief second, something inside him loosened dangerously. Then, a sound. Not from the house, from outside. Quick footsteps. Light. Uneven. Callan straightened, turning toward the door. A figure appeared in the open frame. A boy. About 10 years old. Thin, all elbows and restless energy, as if he had not yet grown into his own limbs. His hair was a messy shade between blonde and light brown, hair sticking out from under a gray knit cap pulled too low over his ears. His cheeks were flushed red from the cold, freckles scattered across his nose. He wore a navy hoodie under a worn brown puffer jacket, jeans darkened at the knees from snow, and boots that had seen more seasons than they should have. He stopped abruptly when he saw Callan. For a second, neither spoke. The boy shifted his weight, clutching something in his hands, a wooden model boat, its small rudder snapped clean off. He began, then faltered. His eyes flicked past Callan, deeper into the workshop. Something in his expression changed, not confusion, not exactly. Recognition, but misplaced, like someone who had arrived expecting a familiar shape and found a shadow instead. "Sorry," he said quickly. "I thought—" He stopped again, swallowing whatever came next. Callan watched him carefully. The boy's posture wasn't careless. It carried a quiet tension. It's the kind children develop when they learn early not to ask for too much. "You thought what?" Callan asked. "That someone was here," the boy said, a little more quietly now. "The light was on yesterday." Callan glanced back at the ceiling. One of the overhead fixtures still flickered faintly from when he had entered. The boy stepped 1 foot inside, hesitant. "I didn't mean to. He lifted the broken boat slightly. "She used to fix things." Callan felt the words land. Used to. The boy knew. He wasn't pretending Evelyn was still here. He just hadn't stopped coming. "What's your name?" Callan asked. "Owen," the boy said. "Owen Harper." He stood there, holding the broken boat like it was something more than wood. Callan nodded once. "Owen," he repeated. Silence stretched. Then Owen said, almost apologetically, "I know she's gone." It was the way he said it that mattered. Not dramatic, not heavy, just accepted, the way children sometimes accept things adults still wrestle with. "But," Owen added, glancing again at the workshop, "oh, and the light's on and it feels like maybe—" He didn't finish. That was the re-hook, not a ghost, not a miracle. Just a child's instinct, honest and unguarded, that something about this place still worked the way it used to, that maybe kindness didn't stop just because one person did. Callan looked at the boat in Owen's hands. The break was clean, fixable, simple, too simple. "I don't do this," Callan said. The words came out automatically. Owen nodded quickly. "Yeah, I figured." But he didn't leave. He just stood there, holding the boat as if waiting, not for permission, but for certainty. Behind them, Briggs moved. The old dog approached Owen slowly, nose lowering to inspect the broken piece. He sniffed once, then looked up, not at the boy, but at Callan. Not asking, not demanding, just present. Callan exhaled through his nose. He could walk away. That was still an option. It was always an option. He could tell the kid to come back later, or not at all. He could shut the workshop, lock the doors, sign the papers, and leave Mercer House to become whatever efficient version of itself the world preferred. No more obligations, no more weight, no more ghosts. His hand tightened slightly against the table. Then he heard his grandmother's voice, not as a sound, but as a memory of tone. Calm, patient, slightly amused at how complicated people made simple things. He looked at the boat again, then at Owen, then at Briggs. "Leave it there," Callan said. Owen blinked. "What?" "On the table," Callan said, already turning away slightly. "I'll look at it." The boy hesitated. "Really?" Callan didn't answer. He had already reached for the clamp. Owen stepped forward quickly, placing the boat down with more care than it probably required. He lingered for a second, then took a step back. "Thank you," he said, voice quiet but bright. Callan picked up the broken rudder piece. The wood felt light in his hand. Familiar. Not because he had done this before, but because real repair always started the same way. With something broken. And someone deciding it wasn't ready to be thrown away. Behind him, Owen slipped out into the cold. The workshop door remained open for a moment longer, letting in a thin line of winter air. Then, it swung shut. Callan stood there, holding the broken piece of wood, the old tools within reach, the weight of the house still pressing behind him. And for the first time since returning, he didn't step back. By midday, the workshop no longer felt like a place that had been asleep. It was still quiet, still carrying the careful order Evelyn had left behind, but something had shifted, something subtle, like a room remembering its purpose. The air itself seemed warmer, though the cold outside had not eased. Light filtered through the upper windows in long, pale bars, settling across the workbench where Callan stood. Sleeves rolled slightly higher than before, hands occupied. The broken rudder from Owen's boat lay secured in a clamp. Callan worked slowly. Not because the repair was difficult. It wasn't. The break had been clean, the wood still good, the alignment easy enough once he found the right angle. But his hands moved with an unfamiliar caution. Not the speed of training, not the precision of practiced habit, but something closer to respect. He wasn't trying to finish. He was trying not to ruin it. Behind him, Briggs lay stretched near the doorway, where the light hit the floor just enough to warm the old wood. The dog had not moved much since they'd come in, but his presence filled the space with a steady kind of awareness, like a silent witness who didn't need to interfere to matter. Callan reached for the small brush, applying adhesive with measured care. He had fixed things before. Not like this. In his world, repair usually meant stopping damage, containing loss, stabilizing what could not be allowed to collapse. It was urgent, loud, driven by consequence. Here, the stakes were quieter, but no less real. A child's boat, a memory, a trust. He pressed the pieces together and held them in place. For a brief second, the image came to him without warning. Evelyn standing at this same bench, fingers steady, was explaining something to a boy who was watching far too closely. Not because the lesson was difficult, but because he believed it mattered. Callan exhaled slowly. He had underestimated her. That realization settled in him without ceremony, like something that had always been true and simply hadn't been acknowledged. The door creaked. Callan glanced up. A woman stood just outside the threshold, hesitating in the cold light before stepping in. She was in her late 30s, maybe early 40s, with a sturdy build that came from work rather than exercise. Her dark hair was tied back in a loose braid, strands escaping around her temples. Her skin was wind-worn, faint lines at the corners of her eyes suggesting both laughter and worry lived there. She wore a thick wool coat in a faded burgundy shade, a scarf looped twice around her neck, and gloves tucked into one pocket. She carried a wooden chair. One of the back legs had snapped clean near the joint. She didn't speak immediately, but her eyes moved around the workshop first, taking in the tables, the tools, the light. Then she looked at Callan. "You're her grandson," she said. She turned. It wasn't a question. Callan nodded once. She shifted the chair slightly in her hands, as if uncertain whether she had the right to bring it further in. "I heard the light was on," she said. "Didn't know if that meant anything or not." Her voice had a practical tone, but beneath it was something softer hope restrained by habit. "Depends what you're expecting," Callan said. A corner of her mouth lifted faintly. "Fair enough." She stepped inside, setting the chair down near the edge of the work area. The broken leg wobbled slightly when it touched the floor. "She fixed this once before," the woman said, brushing her hand along the seat. "5 years ago. My daughter, she climbed it like it was a ladder." She paused, then added, quieter, "Evelyn didn't even charge me. Said if something's part of your house, you don't just throw it away." Callan glanced at the chair, then at the woman. "What's your name?" "Lena," she said. "Lena Harper." The name landed with a faint echo. "Owen's mother," Callan said. She nodded. "Figured he'd come by here," she said, not unkindly. "He's got it in his head that this place doesn't stop working just because—" She let the sentence fade. Callan didn't finish it for her. He looked back at the chair. The break was older than the one on Owen's boat. The wood had splintered unevenly, fibers pulled rather than cleanly cut. It would take more effort, more care. He could say no. That option still existed, but it was getting harder to reach. "Leave it," he said. Lena studied him for a moment, as if measuring something not immediately visible. "You sure?" "No," Callan said honestly. "But leave it anyway." That earned him a small, tired smile. She didn't thank him again. She just nodded and stepped back, pulling her coat tighter as she moved toward the door. As she reached it, she paused, looking over her shoulder once more. "She kept a lot of us from falling apart," Lena said. "Didn't make a show of it. Just did it." Then she left. The door closed behind her with a muted thud. The workshop felt different now. Not fuller, not louder. Just claimed. Callan stood still for a moment, then turned back to the workbench. The rudder was set, the glue drying. He released the clamp carefully and tested the joint. Solid. Not perfect, but strong enough. He placed the boat aside. Then he picked up the chair leg. The wood felt heavier, more resistant, more complicated. He rotated the broken end, examining the fibers, the stress lines, the subtle shifts in grain that would determine how it could be restored. And for a moment, something in his chest tightened, not from doubt, but from recognition. This wasn't about fixing wood. It never had been. The sound came again. Another set of footsteps, slower this time. He looked up. A man stood just beyond the doorway. Older. Late 60s, maybe early 70s. Tall once, but age had taken a quiet inch or two from his posture. His shoulders sloped slightly forward, not in weakness, but in the way of someone who had spent years carrying weight without complaint. His hair was thin and gray, combed back with stubborn care. His face was angular, lined deeply around the mouth and eyes, the kind of lines that came from holding back more than expressing. He wore a heavy canvas coat, the color of worn earth, a gray wool sweater underneath, and dark work pants tucked into boots that had seen better winters. A wooden cane rested in his right hand. Not decorative, not for show. Necessary. He didn't step inside. Not at first. He stood there, looking into the workshop with a gaze that held more memory than curiosity. "Didn't expect it open," he said. His voice was rough, low, like something that had been sanded down by time. Callan met his eyes. "Neither did I." The man gave a short, almost humorless nod. "Walter Boone," he said after a moment. "Used to come by here. More than I'd admit." Callan gestured toward the interior. "Then you probably know where everything is better than I do." Walter stepped in slowly, the cane tapping once against the floor. His eyes moved across the space, not missing anything. He didn't touch the tools, didn't reach for the bench. He just stood there, as if confirming that something he had relied on had not vanished entirely. "She never made it feel like asking," Walter said quietly. "That's a rare thing." Callan didn't respond. Walter shifted his weight, glancing toward the chair Lena had left behind. "She charged you?" he asked. "No." "Good," Walter muttered. "Would have been a shame if she started now." There was no humor in the statement, but no hostility either, just a kind of guarded respect. Walter moved a few steps further in, then stopped near the workbench. For a moment, as the three of them, man, dog, and old memory, shared the space without speaking. Then, Briggs stood. The movement was slow, deliberate. He walked past Callan, past the workbench, and stopped beside Walter. The old man looked down. The dog looked up. Neither moved. It lasted only a few seconds. But in that space, something unspoken passed between them. Recognition, perhaps. Not of identity, but of shared time. Walter's grip on the cane shifted slightly. "Huh," he said under his breath. That was the re-hook, not loud, not dramatic, but enough. A dog acknowledging a man as if both had belonged to the same quiet story before the current one had begun. Walter looked back at Callan. "She kept him too, didn't she?" Callan nodded. Walter gave a small, slow nod in return. "Figures," he said. He turned toward the door. "Don't let this place go," he added, almost as an afterthought. Then he stepped out into the cold. The workshop fell silent again. Callan stood where he was, and the chair leg still in his hand, Briggs now returning to his place near the door. Outside, the wind moved through the trees. Inside, the tools waited. The tools. The house behind him held its weight. The chair on the floor. The boat on the table. The ledger on the shelf. None of it demanded anything. That was the hardest part. It simply existed. Waiting. Callan exhaled slowly, then reached for the next tool. Not because he had decided anything, but because leaving it unfinished now felt worse than staying. The house felt different that night. Not louder, not warmer. Just occupied in a way Callan hadn't noticed before. Not by people. There were still only 2 living souls inside Mercer House, and one of them had 4 legs, but by something harder to name. A kind of quiet tension that settled between rooms, as if the house itself had begun paying attention to him. Callan sat alone in the study. Graham's documents still lay spread across the desk, untouched, their clean lines and legal language waiting for a signature that refused to come. Outside the window, the lake had gone dark, its surface swallowing what little light remained. The reflection of the room hovered faintly in the glass lamp glow. Bookshelves, his own figure seated in the chair that had once belonged to Evelyn. He leaned back slightly, staring at nothing in particular. The day had changed something. Not in any dramatic, irreversible way. He hadn't made decisions. He hadn't accepted anything fully. But the line he had been standing behind, the one that separated involvement from detachment, had blurred. He had repaired the boat. He had accepted the chair. People had come. And he had not sent them away. That alone unsettled him more than anything Graham had said. He reached forward and picked up the photograph Briggs had brought him the day before. The wood frame was worn smooth along the edges, the kind of wear that came from hands, not accidents. He turned it slightly, letting the lamplight catch the glass. Evelyn's smile held steady inside it. For a long time, he simply looked. Then, without thinking, he pressed his thumb against the back panel. It shifted. Just slightly. Callan frowned. He turned the frame over fully now, resting it against the desk. The back was secured by small metal tabs. But one of them had been bent just enough to loosen the panel. Not broken, not careless, intentional. His fingers stilled. A faint tension moved through him. Not fear, not exactly, but something close to anticipation. The kind of quiet alertness that came before entering a room you knew might hold something you weren't ready for. He lifted the tab. Then another. The backing loosened. And when he slid it away, a folded piece of paper slipped free. It was old enough to have softened at the edges, but not brittle. The fold lines were clean, deliberate. His name wasn't written on the outside. Nothing was. Callan stared at it for a moment before opening it. The handwriting was unmistakable. Evelyn's. Steady, slightly slanted. No wasted space. He didn't read it all at once. He couldn't. Instead, his eyes moved slowly, taking in each line like it required separate permission. You always believed strength had to look like struggle. He swallowed. And so the words didn't accuse, they didn't comfort either. They simply knew. You thought the safest way to live was to choose the hardest road, because anything easier must mean you were depending on something you hadn't earned. His jaw tightened. He hadn't said that to her, not in so many words, but she had seen it anyway. I never tried to argue with you about that. Some lessons don't survive explanation. They have to wait until life puts them in your hands. His grip on the paper shifted slightly. The room around him faded, not physically, but in relevance. The study, the house, the silence. All of it stepped back as the letter took its place. You chose your way of protecting people. I chose mine. His breath caught. The simplicity of it was what hurt. Not defense, not comparison, just fact. This house, this land, the money, it was never the point. It was only ever the means. Callan leaned forward slightly, the paper trembling almost imperceptibly between his fingers. There are people who survive because someone stands in front of danger. And there are people who survive because someone made sure they never had to face it alone. The words settled into him slowly. Not like a realization. More like something being uncovered that had always been there. Neither is greater than the other, but one is quieter. He closed his eyes for a second. Not long. Just enough to steady himself. When he looked down again, the final lines waited. If you ever come back here, and don't know what to do, don't ask what you can keep. Ask what you can continue. The paper felt heavier now. Not physically, but in the way truth sometimes did when it arrived without decoration. Callan sat there for a long time. The fire in the adjacent room had burned low. The clock ticked somewhere in the hall. The house did not interrupt. Eventually, he folded the letter back along its original lines. Not because he was done with it, because he wasn't. He placed it carefully on the desk beside the frame. And for the first time since returning, he didn't feel like he was standing outside of something. He felt like he had stepped into it. The next morning came clearer than the last. Callan moved through the house with more purpose, though he would not have admitted it if asked. He checked the back door latch, looked at the path leading toward the workshop, paused briefly in the kitchen as Martha prepared breakfast. She watched him for a moment, then said nothing. That, more than any question, told him she had noticed. Briggs followed him outside. The air carried a sharper bite today, the kind that stung the inside of the nose and made breath visible in thick, short bursts. The sky was clean blue, stretched thin across the horizon. They walked toward the workshop together. This time Callan didn't hesitate at the door. He opened it. He stepped inside and went straight to the workbench. The chair Lena had brought still waited where he had left it. The repaired boat sat beside it, the glue fully set, the surface sanded smooth. He picked up the chair leg again, turned it, examined the grain. His movements were more certain now, not confident, but less resistant. Behind him, Briggs settled into his usual place, watching. Callan worked in silence. Time passed differently in the workshop. It didn't rush. It didn't drag. It simply moved, steady and unremarkable, like a current beneath the surface. The door opened again. Callan glanced up. A woman stepped inside. New, unfamiliar. She was in her late 30s, maybe early 40s, with a lean build that suggested long days spent on her feet. Her hair was dark brown, pulled into a tight ponytail, a few loose strands framing a face marked by focus rather than softness. And her skin carried the faint pallor of someone who worked indoors more often than not. But her posture was alert, controlled. She wore a navy parka zipped to the throat, utility pants, and sturdy waterproof boots. A stethoscope peeked from the pocket of her jacket. She paused just inside the doorway, her eyes adjusting quickly to the interior. "You must be Callan Mercer," she said. Her voice was calm, direct, with no wasted tone. "Depends who's asking," he replied. A small flicker of something not quite amusement touched her expression. "Dr. Leah Whitmore," she said. "Town vet." Callan nodded once. "I've seen Briggs a few times since." She didn't finish the sentence. She didn't need to. "Martha mentioned you were back." Her gaze shifted to the dog. Briggs lifted his head slightly but didn't stand. Leah stepped closer, crouching down with practiced ease. Her movements were efficient but not rushed, hands steady as she reached out, letting the dog scent her before making contact. "Hey, old man," she murmured. Briggs allowed it. She ran her fingers along his side, light but precise, feeling beneath the fur rather than just over it. Checked the joints, the ribs, the breathing. Her expression didn't change much, but something in her eyes sharpened. "He's holding," she said after a moment, standing again. "But he's older than he looks from a distance. Joints are stiff, likely some chronic inflammation. Maybe cardiac strain starting, but nothing acute yet." Callan listened without interrupting. Leah glanced at him. "He doesn't need saving," she said. "He needs consistency." The words landed clean, not emotional, not heavy, just accurate. She adjusted her jacket slightly. "There's a team scheduled to come pick him up in a few days," she added. "Senior Animal Services. They're good. Quiet place. Proper care." Callan didn't respond immediately. Leah studied him for a second longer than necessary. Then she said, "Or he stays here." Not a suggestion. A statement. She gave Briggs one last scratch behind the ear, and then stepped back. "Your call," she said. And with that she turned and left. The door closed behind her. Silence returned. Callan stood at the workbench, the chair leg still in his hands. The letter's words lingered somewhere just behind his thoughts. Not pushing, not demanding, just present. He looked down at the wood, then at Briggs. The dog met his gaze, steady as always. And for the first time, the question in Callan's mind shifted. Not how long can I stay? But what happens if I don't? The thaw came too fast. By the third morning after Leah's visit, the air had shifted in a way even Callan could not ignore. It wasn't warmer in a comforting sense, It was unstable. The cold had loosened its grip too quickly, and the land hadn't had time to adjust. Snow melted unevenly. The ground softened in patches. Water ran where it shouldn't, thin streams cutting new paths through old ones. From the back porch, Callan stood with one hand resting against the railing, watching the slope down toward the lake. Something felt wrong. Not visibly catastrophic, not dramatic, but wrong in the way a seasoned soldier recognized before anything broke subtle, structural, the kind of wrong that didn't announce itself until it was too late. Behind him, the workshop door stood open. He had been working more regularly now, though he still wouldn't have called it commitment. The chair Lena had brought was nearly finished. A few more items had appeared, left quietly, respectfully, as if people understood the space was open again, but didn't want to overwhelm it. He hadn't refused any of them. That fact had stopped surprising him. Briggs moved past him, stepping onto the porch with deliberate care. The old dog paused, nose lifting slightly, testing the air. His posture changed, subtle, but unmistakable. Not alert in the aggressive sense, but attentive in a deeper way, as if something beneath the surface had shifted. Callan noticed. "What is it?" he murmured. Briggs didn't respond. He moved forward, descending the steps slowly, each paw placed with precision. His gaze fixed not on the workshop, not on the house, but toward the far edge of the property, where the land sloped down more sharply toward the lake. Callan followed. The ground felt different underfoot, softer, unstable. He crouched near a shallow depression in the earth, pressing his hand against the soil. It gave slightly, moisture seeping up where it shouldn't. Runoff. Too much, too fast. His eyes tracked the slope. Following the path, water had begun carving. It led toward a narrow stretch near the lakeside, where the land flattened briefly before dropping again. He knew that area. Everyone in town did. It was where the small community path met the edge of Mercer Land, a place where people gathered in better weather, where children ran, where temporary stands and small events sometimes took place when the season allowed. Callan stood slowly. His jaw tightened. This wasn't just about his property. It was about where that water was going. By late morning, the first voices carried up from below. Distant at first, then clearer. Callan moved quickly down the slope, boots sliding slightly in the damp earth. Briggs followed, slower but steady, toe refusing to be left behind. As they neared the lower ground, the scene opened. A handful of people had already gathered near the lakeside clearing. Wooden stands, temporary, lightly built, had been set up along the edge, remnants of preparations for a small, early spring gathering the town had planned. Nothing large, just enough to bring people out after winter. Children moved between them, too close to the edge. Callan scanned the area quickly. The ground near the waterline was darker, saturated, and beneath it, unstable. Owen! The boy's name left his mouth before he consciously decided to call it. Owen turned from near one of the stands, his small figure bundled in the same oversized jacket, face flushed from the cold and movement. "I'm here!" he shouted back. Too close. Callan moved faster. "Everyone back from the edge," he called, voice cutting through the air with command that hadn't dulled. Some listened immediately. Others hesitated. That hesitation was enough. The earth shifted. It didn't collapse all at once. That would have been cleaner. Instead, it gave way in stages. First a subtle sinking, then a sudden drop, where the ground closest to the lake slid downward, pulling a section of one wooden stand with it. A sharp crack echoed as the structure twisted and broke apart. A child screamed. Water surged into the gap. Callan reached Owen just as the boy lost footing, grabbing him by the back of his jacket and pulling him clear in one motion. The boy stumbled into him, breath sharp, eyes wide. "Stay behind me," Callan said, pushing him back toward safer ground. He turned immediately. 2 other children stood frozen near the shifting edge, too stunned to move. "Move!" he shouted. One of them did. The other slipped. The ground beneath the child's feet collapsed inward, dropping them to their knees at the edge, where mud and ice mixed into something treacherous. As Callan moved without hesitation. Downward. Fast. His boots hit unstable ground, sliding, adjusting, finding purchase where it shouldn't have existed. He reached the child, grabbing their arm just as another section of earth broke away beneath them. Behind him, Briggs barked. Loud, sharp, not panic. Warning. Callan didn't turn. He didn't need to. He trusted the sound. He shifted his weight instinctively, avoiding the direction the dog had marked. That was the re-hook. Not a miracle. Not coincidence. A bond formed over years, now reduced to a single, critical second one voice, one adjustment, the difference between holding ground and losing it. Callan pulled the child upward, muscles straining as the mud gave beneath his boots. His knee sank, cold water biting through fabric, but he didn't release his grip. "Go!" he snapped once the child regained footing. The kid scrambled away. Callan followed, pushing himself back toward stable ground. One hand reached for you as he came up, someone grabbing his arm, another steadying his shoulder. He barely registered them. His focus moved outward, counting, scanning. Everyone accounted for. No one missing. The stands were damaged. The ground near the lake had collapsed in sections. Water moved unpredictably now, cutting new paths through what had been solid only hours before. But no one was gone. That mattered. The sound of an engine approached shortly after. A sheriff's vehicle pulled up along the higher access path, tires crunching against gravel and melting frost. The door opened, and a man stepped out with the controlled urgency of someone who had responded to enough situations like this to know panic helped no one. Deputy Rowan Pike. He was in his early 40s, tall, broad-shouldered, without excess, his movements efficient and grounded. His uniform dark, practical, worn from real use, sat under a heavy jacket, badge catching brief flashes of light as he moved. His hair was short, his jaw clean-shaven but set with habitual tension. His eyes were sharp, not unkind, but accustomed to measuring risk before trust. He took in the scene in seconds. "You got everyone out?" he asked, voice direct. "Yes," Callan said. Rowan nodded once. "Good." No praise, no wasted words, just acknowledgement. He turned to the others, organizing them quickly, directing people away from the unstable ground, marking off the area with what limited resources they had. Callan stepped back slightly, breath still uneven but controlled. Briggs stood beside him now, chest rising slower than before, but steady. The old dog had followed him down. Of course he had. Callan looked at him for a moment. "You're not supposed to be doing that anymore," he muttered. Briggs didn't respond. He simply stood there, watching the shifting ground with the same quiet intensity he had carried since the house. By the time the area was secured and people began dispersing, the sun had climbed higher, but offered no warmth. Rowan approached Callan again. "You knew that was going to give," he said. Callan shook his head slightly. "Not exactly, just didn't like how it looked." Rowan studied him for a moment. "You military?" he asked. Was. A pause, then a small nod. Figures? There was no challenge in the word, just recognition. Rowan glanced back toward the damaged ground, then toward the slope leading up to Mercer House. That section, he said, gesturing lightly, wasn't supposed to go that fast. Callan followed his gaze. No, he said quietly. It wasn't. The implication settled between them. Not accusation, but understanding. Something that had once been maintained wasn't anymore. Rowan didn't press. He didn't need to. He turned away, moving back toward his vehicle, already shifting focus to what came next. Callan remained where he was for a moment longer. The lake moved quietly. The ground had changed. And in that change, something else became clear. Not through words, not through thought, but through the simple weight of consequence. This place had not held itself together by accident. It had been held. And now, it wasn't. He looked down at Briggs. The dog met his gaze, steady as ever. Then Callan turned toward the hill, toward the house, toward the workshop. And for the first time since returning, the weight of staying no longer felt like a burden. It felt like something that had already begun. The morning the truck arrived, the sky was clear, not warm, not forgiving, but open in a way that made everything feel visible. Like there was no place left to hide from decisions that had been waiting too long. Callan stood on the front porch of Mercer House, one hand resting against the railing, watching the gravel road below. He had been awake since before dawn. Not restless, not pacing. Just awake. The kind of awareness that didn't come from noise or thought, but from knowing something was approaching that would not be postponed. Behind him, the house held its quiet, the way it always did now. Not empty, not full, but settled into a rhythm that included him whether he had agreed to it or not. Martha moved somewhere in the kitchen, steady as ever, giving him space without asking questions she already knew the answer to. In the yard, the frost still clung lightly to the grass, turning each blade silver under the early light. Briggs lay near the edge of the porch, his body angled toward the drive. He had been there for a while. Not waiting, exactly, but aware. The old dog's breathing was slow, measured. His body showed the quiet fatigue of years, joints stiffened by cold mornings and time. Yet there was nothing diminished in the way he held himself. His head was lifted, his gaze fixed outward, not anxious, present. Callan watched him for a moment. "You always know before I do, don't you?" he said quietly. Briggs didn't turn. The sound of the engine reached them first, low, steady, approaching along the narrow road that curved up toward the house. Gravel shifted under tires. The vehicle came into view moments later. White, clean, marked with the county insignia for animal services. It stopped at the base of the drive. The engine cut. For a second, nothing moved. Then the driver's door opened. A woman stepped out. She was in her mid-30s, maybe a little younger, with a compact, capable build that suggested someone used to lifting weight that didn't always cooperate. Her hair was tied back in a loose ponytail, light brown catching hints of gold in the morning sun. Her face was unadorned, practical, no makeup, no pretense, but not unkind. There was something in her eyes that spoke of long days and quiet patience, the kind of patience that came from working with animals that couldn't explain their pain. She wore a faded olive jacket with a county patch on the sleeve, heavy-duty pants, and boots built for mud and cold. A clipboard rested under one arm. A leash hung loosely from her hand. She closed the door gently. Then she looked up at the house. Her gaze lingered there for a moment, not in curiosity, but in recognition. People in her line of work saw a lot of endings. She knew what this place represented. Callan stepped down from the porch before she could call out. Their eyes met halfway across the yard. "Nina Brooks," she said as she approached. "County Senior Animal Services." Her voice was calm, even. No forced warmth. No cold detachment. Just someone used to stepping into moments people didn't prepare for. "Callan Mercer," he replied. She nodded once. Her gaze shifted past him, landing on Briggs. The dog had risen now. Slowly. Carefully. But fully. Nina studied him the way professionals did, quick, efficient, assessing condition without making it obvious. "Older than I expected," she said quietly, "but still holding together." Callan didn't respond. She stepped a little closer, but not too close. Enough to be present. Not enough to intrude. "I've got a place ready for him," she said. "Quiet facility, heated, staffed around the clock. Dogs his age do well there. Less stress." Her words were practiced, not rehearsed. There was a difference. Callan looked at Briggs. The dog stood still, ears slightly forward, eyes moving between them. No resistance, no fear. That was the hardest part. If Briggs had fought, barked, refused, it would have made the decision easier. Conflict always clarified things. But this was acceptance, and acceptance carried its own kind of weight. Callan exhaled slowly. Behind him, he heard the front door open. Martha stepped out onto the porch, her hands resting lightly against the railing as she watched. Her expression was composed, but her eyes carried something deeper understanding, perhaps, or the quiet grief of someone who had seen too many things leave. Further down the slope, two figures lingered near the edge of the yard. Owen stood beside his mother, Lena, both of them still, as if unsure whether they were meant to witness this or not. And just beyond them, near the line of trees, Walter Boone stood with his cane planted firmly against the ground, posture rigid, gaze fixed. The house wasn't empty. It was watching. Callan became aware of that all at once, not in a literal sense, but in the way choices, when they mattered, drew quiet witnesses without invitation. Nina shifted her weight slightly. "I don't rush these," she said. "Take your time." She wasn't looking at him now. She was looking at Briggs. The dog stepped forward, not toward Callan, toward her. 2 steps. Then he stopped. His head lowered slightly, as if testing something in the air. And then he turned. Not back to Callan immediately, but toward the house, toward the porch, toward the space behind it. His gaze lingered there for a long second. That was the re-hook, not a refusal, not confusion. Something else. A pause filled with memory. A creature standing at the edge of departure, looking once, just once, at the place that had given him purpose. Then he turned back and walked, straight toward Nina. Callan felt something tighten in his chest. It was not panic, not anger, something quieter, final. Nina crouched slightly, letting Briggs approach on his own terms. She clipped the leash gently to the harness, her movements smooth, practiced. No sudden gestures, no tension. "Easy, boy," she murmured. Briggs didn't resist. He stood beside her, calm, ready. Callan took a step forward, then stopped. His mind ran through it all in a single, compressed line of thought. The letter, the workshop, the ledger, the slope near the lake, The people. What Evelyn had built. What had begun to fall apart. What had started just barely to hold again. And in the middle of all of it, this dog. Not a symbol, not a memory. A living piece of it. Nina stood, leash in hand. She looked at Callan now. "Last chance," she said. Not as pressure, just truth. Callan met her gaze. For a moment, he said nothing. Then, "I'll take him." The words didn't come out loud. They came out certain. Nina didn't move. She studied him. People say that sometimes," she said. "Doesn't always mean they understand what it takes." Callan nodded once. "I'm not saying it because it's easy." A pause. "I'm saying it because it isn't." That landed. Nina's expression shifted, not dramatically, but enough. "Then say it clearly," she said. Callan stepped forward. Close enough now that Briggs could see him without turning. "He stays," Callan said. No hesitation. No qualifiers. "He stays here." Silence held for a second. Then Nina reached down and unclipped the leash. The soft click echoed louder than it should have. Briggs didn't move immediately. Then he stepped away from her, back toward Callan. Slow. Steady. He stopped at his side. Close. Familiar. Callan rested his hand lightly against the dog's neck. The fur was coarse, warm, real. Behind them, Martha exhaled softly. Owen shifted, a small, relieved movement. Walter said nothing, but he didn't leave. Nina straightened. "All right," she said. Then he's yours." She hesitated for a moment, then added, "I'll leave you my contact. If you need help, meds, advice, anything." Callan nodded. She handed him the card, then turned back toward the truck. She didn't rush, didn't linger, just left the way she had come. The engine started. The vehicle pulled away. The road quieted again. Callan stood there for a long moment, Briggs beside him, the house behind him, the land stretching out in front. The decision didn't feel dramatic. It didn't feel like a turning point. It felt like something settling into place, like a piece of a structure finding where it belonged. He looked down at Briggs. "You're staying," he said. The dog didn't react. He didn't need to. Callan turned toward the house. The workshop beyond it. The slope. The lake. Everything that had been left behind. Everything that had nearly slipped. Everything that could still be held. He stepped forward, not away, but into it. In the end, it was never just about a house, or a piece of land, or even a loyal dog who refused to forget. It was about the quiet ways love stays behind. Some miracles don't arrive with light from the sky or voices from above. Sometimes they arrive as a second chance you didn't think you deserved. A door that stays open when you expected it to close. A life that gently asks you to try again. Maybe that is how God works, not always in ways that break the world apart, but in ways that hold it together when no one is looking. In the warmth of a home that refuses to feel empty. In the presence of a companion who chooses to stay. In the moment you realize you are still capable of becoming someone better than yesterday. And maybe the greatest miracle is this, that even after everything you've lost, yes, you are still being given something to protect. If this story touched your heart, take a moment to share it with someone who might need a reminder that they are not alone. Tell us in the comments where you are watching from, and what part of the story stayed with you. And if you believe in stories that heal, don't forget to subscribe so we can continue bringing you more journeys like this. May God bless you, guide you, and keep you safe in whatever season of life you are walking through.